All right. Well, good morning. I see we're with quite a group this morning, and I hope you tuned in from your most likely living room on a quite sunny day. We're here today to talk about dealing with resistance on team and management level, and I'm glad to have you all on board. So for this coming hour, we will slightly dive into the world of resistance for a bit. We could talk about this topic for, well, hours and hours, but we only have 1 hour today. So it will be, a quick deep dive, and hopefully some of your ideas or issues will be at least inspired, or you can start thinking about these things in another way. We have a chat available. I see Karine saying hi, Renate. So hi there. Please use the chat as well. So we try to respond during the session, and otherwise we will indeed book time in the end of the session to answer the questions you might have or the ideas you might want to share as well. So that's the chat that's available right there. And for the rest, we will present you with some slides here that will also be available for you in the end. So that's that. So what will we talk about? We will talk about resistance that can show at any level or at any moment. And before we do this, a little bit of the context that might be relevant. I'm working as an Agile coach and Agile trainer at Gladwell Academy. And at Gladwell, we mainly work with organizations on all kind of levels. So governmental, corporate, insurance, anything you can think of. And there we face both team and management with their transition in agility. So Agile coach and Agile trainer. From my side, currently, I'm besides training on Agile, so Scrum Masters, product owners and such, also a trainer on Agile coaching a lot, and an Agile coach myself. So that means current assignments at the Municipal of Rotterdam, and that's more on the team level, while on other assignments it might be more on the management level. So what's the background from my side? How did I join Gladwell? Started with a study in psychology, and that was specifically behavioral and organizational psychology. And from there on, dealing a lot with teams, people, motivation to work, how to collaborate, how to interact with each other. And as you most likely all know, this also is of great impact when we're looking at working in Agile teams. And with regards to this, there has been some more of studies I've been doing. So you can see here an IC Agile, so that's of the Agile coaching, but also on the coaching topic for ICF, the International Coaching Federation, which I got a nice new tip in the chat that we need to update the logo. Besides that, so that's more on the coaching side, coaching meaning the ethics and the competences that go around with coaching, but also we do work with the SAFe framework, scrum.org, and other more Agile related certifications. Well, besides that, living in Amsterdam and currently working from home, obviously, so the world really changed, and nowadays it's coaching remotely, which might also influence the resistance you get or you don't get, but we talk about that a little later. So before we start talking about the title of the webinar, how to deal with team and resistance on team and management level, I want to prompt you with an idea, because it is actually quite difficult to answer this question. How do you deal with team and management resistance? Because what is actually resistance? And in my opinion, there's no clear-cut answer to that. We can perceive anything as it being resistance. Somebody telling you, no, I don't want to do that, but also maybe people that do go along with the story you tell or with the question you ask them, they still might indirectly show any form of resistance. So the topic of resistance is really broad, and we get this question a lot. How do you even in training, or if you do one-on-one coaching, how do you deal with resistance? But because resistance can be so indirect or sensitive, or you might not even spot it, it is a really tough question to tackle. And therefore, I first want to prompt you with this question: how would you actually define resistance? What does it mean for you when you think about resistance? And then also trying to make it a little bit interactive. I want you to ask you to go to menti.com and use the following code. That's 2281117. So at menti.com, go to 2281117 and answer the question, how would you define resistance? And if you would do that, you would see the following. Would you mind giving me some inputs? How would you define resistance? Menti.com 2281117. Denial, I see. Yeah. Obstructive behavior, I guess. Fear. Not complying with change. Yeah, so that's something that we as Agile coaches or Agile trainers see a lot. We want something to change, but how do people react to that? Great, more is coming in, thank you. Refusing to passive behavior, yeah, that's more of the indirect resistance we know. Neglectance. Conservative behavior, maybe. Great, more and more is coming in. Stick to the unknown. Afraid to losing position, yeah, so there you already sense a little bit of the ego coming in as well. Something that we all recognize, I think. Unwillingness to learn. All right. Well, this is quite a nice word web already. And what strikes here for me is that it is indeed a lot about how you perceive a certain kind of behavior. And yeah, we see believing in things. We see that there's the pushback that people give. And in our job, so as an Agile coach, this might become really frustrating because we set ourselves an ambition. We want to go somewhere. And then we get this sort of like reactions in something that with something that we really believe in. So we want to move forward, but then something is blocking us. And well, as mentioned, these you already see it. These are all like very different kind of behaviors. And that's actually what I want to talk about, because if it's showing in a different way, it most likely means that it's coming from a different belief as well, or from a different trigger. So that's what we're going to talk about. How can you, from your position as a coach or a consultant or an advisor, how can you go to the deeper root cause so that you can have a proper response to, well, anything that we see here on the web and on the spider. Thanks for sharing. I obviously did also look at the definition of resistance. So if you ask a question, then you also should give an answer. So what we see in definition of the word resistance, it's the refusal to accept or to comply with something. And then if we look at this first sentence, the refusal to accept or comply with something, and that can show in anything that you mentioned here. So this is the internal process, what we see on the slide, and this is the reaction that people give. So if this number one is the internal process, then where does the process originate from? That's a question we want to ask ourselves. 2, the ability not to be affected by something, especially adversely. So some of us have a low resistance to cold. Okay, so it impacts the person or not, and thereby again, we get a certain behavior. So I think a lot of these things that we see in the spider's behavior, and now we're going to look at, okay, where does the behavior originate from? And what I think that is really interesting, if we bridge behavior or the origin of a behavior to an agile context, then what we want within agility is we want to see how can we optimize our environment? How can we, in the structures that we already have in place, so if you go to an organization and you might have an assignment to work with a team or work with the management, so more on an organizational level, we might want to ask ourselves, okay, what is our assignment about? Is it about strengthening the collaboration? Is it about that we want to have a faster response to the client, or faster time to market, or less bugs or defects? It could all be questions that get placed for us, and that they say, can you help us out with this problem? And we might face these sort of behaviors, but what is in the cure with all the agile transformations that we go in, or trying to optimize things, is that we want to think about, from the perspective of agility, how to slowly, incrementally make small steps to change. And I think that's very important, because you know this from yourself, if you have to radically change, as we, for example, had to do with COVID, you'll resist yourself as well, because you cannot go from the one extreme to the other in one day. That's tough for people. What we can do is take it step by step by step. And that's what we're trying to achieve with taking an iterative and incremental approach. So if we bridge it to the world of agility, I want to, for once, once more, refer to the Agile Manifesto, because actually this manifesto is all about behavior on its own. You mentioned in your word web, when I asked for assistance, a lot of behavioral types. But if we look at this one, people in interaction over processes and tools. I think you all know this Agile Manifesto, so I won't go into it too much. But people in interaction, that's behavior. So we need to, or we want to, as coaches and trainers, think of how can we optimize this system of people and behavior and interactions, or people and interaction, so that this behavior is optimized. Thinking about always having working products is a mindset of thinking about value, client value. Less directly linked to behavior, but maybe indirectly it is. Collaboration with the customer, strongly about behavior. And responding to change, strongly about how do we react, what is the behavior. So why am I mentioning this? A lot of things we're trying to do here, although we use processes like Scrum and processes like SAFe, a lot of this is about people behavior. And what can we do with people behavior? We can try to listen what's happening, try something new, fail or succeed and learn from that and try again. And this all in incremental and iterative steps. But then what is quite interesting, if we try to do this as an advisor, coach, or consultant, we might run into a set of psychological biases. And in chat, indeed, I see Jude saying culture is the sum of all behaviors, and that's totally correct. And what we're trying to achieve here with Agile is changing that culture, changing that mindset. What we might run into in making small steps to change is a set of biases. And I want to show you a set of psychological biases, cognitive biases. And it's too much to go into detail, but I do want to prompt you, because we're now going to try to look at what's behind all the behavior that we see. And in this case, we talk about resistance, so we talk about resistant behavior. There is a set of 12 biases, cognitive biases, that we know from psychology. And I just want to prompt you to start thinking about root causes of resistance. So that's what we build towards. You can read along. It's too much to go into all of them, but I want to highlight a few. So if we look at, for example, number 2, A well-known bias in psychology is that the availability bias, making decisions based on immediate information or examples that come to mind. So just imagine you're in a team and they're in this maybe treadmill because they've been getting new requirements all the time, and they have to comply with their targets, and they want to fulfill the customer needs. But then they are only they're a little bit biased on what's available in information at that point in time. So they might not think about other options to improve or to optimize their system. And if that doesn't come to mind, then you would never innovate on it as well. So that's the first bias we might see. Or 4, choice supportive bias. So once a decision to go a certain direction is made, people tend to really focus on that and only see the benefits of this one. And there you come as an agile coach and you say, hey guys, let's think about this in a different manner. And then people might go like, no, I mean, we already made our choice. And like the waterfall approach is maybe the best one, so let's go for that. Or number 5, confirmation bias. Paying more attention to the information that reinforces previously held beliefs and ignoring the evidence that goes contradictory. Here you come, maybe as an agile coach, and you say, hey, in research it says that people get really more motivated and happy and engaged in their work if we give them more autonomy. And I'm like, no, I didn't listen, or I didn't see that research, or I don't know about this, or we're doing actually quite well already with regards to motivation, something you might recognize as well. We don't need that. We don't need to use a Scrum board, or we don't need that transparency because we're already doing quite fine. Well, there are way more, I said 12. So while you read along and the slides are available. 10, avoiding bad news. So just don't listen to it and continue with what you're doing. Maybe if an error is made, and actually in the Agile manifesto we say, let's learn from it. And now we say, okay, that didn't happen. Let's not pay attention to that. Or actually only looking at the short term and the recency effect. The things that pop into mind are those that happened recently. So these are like interesting for you to think of when you feel that a certain unproductive behavior is happening. Can you place it somewhere on these biases, and do you understand what actually is going on? Because this is a natural tendency, so it's not that strange that people go into this bias. This is just what our brain does. Now the question is, what can you do? Actually, especially from the role of the coach. So if you say the agile coach, it's try not to push, because pushing will result in getting more and more resistance. So the harder you push, the more resistance you get. So what can you do is ask questions and provoke, so that you can slowly unravel the complexity that it's there in somebody's head. And especially with these biases we saw before, what can you do is you can try to ask questions so that that you drag them out of the bias they're actually in. So that's something that we want to achieve, which is tough because we have our own biases as well. And we obviously have our own ego as well. So you know something goes very wrong or is unproductive. And then it's painful to see something going into the wrong direction. So a lot of talking, a lot of high over ideas. And now let's try to make this a little bit more concrete. So summing it up, we say Agile is mainly about behavior of people. We use frameworks like Scrum and SAFe in order to bring in new routines. And with these new routines, hopefully change the culture, which is the sum of all these behaviors. We might run into a set of biases, which we saw before. And what we try to do is listen and ask questions so that we unravel the complexity. But how? I'm going to introduce you at least one model that I really like to use. when facing these difficult problems or facing this complexity. And I want to like more in a storytelling manner, tell you how to use them. So imagine if we have the following situation. We start with resistance at team level. And this is actually something that happened this year during one of my assignments. So imagine you are an Agile coach. It's more of a traditional organization. And your contact person or your client asks you to kickstart Scrum within her team. So you step into the workplace, and you go talk with people. You make a system map, what's going on here in this organization, how do people behave and interact with each other. And then you decide to do a kickoff session. So during the first more agile-oriented session, because the idea here is to introduce Scrum, you share some war stories and tell about the agile mindset. So war stories, what can it help the team to work with Scrum or in a Scrum manner? And you see everybody like start looking at their phone, and they start doing different things, and they don't listen anymore. So it's not resonating with them. And nobody knows why you share these stories and who are you anyway, because you just walked in, and who are you to tell how it should be done? Now, I don't know if this is something that you recognize, but maybe in chat, what would you do as an Agile coach if this would happen? So you already held the first session on the Agile mindset. Now, what would you do next? Because you feel the resistance in people not willing or not able to change. To make a joke, to get their attention, start with team. Yeah, start with the pain points. Yeah, ask why they think you are here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's funny, Rika, because as the manager to introduce why you're here, so she can explain. Yeah, that's something indeed that was done already. So that's funny. Yeah, there was already individual conversations, and then the manager introduced, and anything like that happened. And still, you feel there's like tension in the room. Like mostly it comes from if you say we need to change, then you're also telling us that we didn't do our work in a proper manner. And thanks for all the ideas that you just prompted. At this sort of situations, what I normally do is I go back to the drawing table and I look at the Knoster chains model. And I don't know if some of you recognize this one, but this is just for myself. So what I do is I look at this model, the Knoster chains model, and just first introducing it to you, because I strongly believe you can really get some nice ideas out of thinking about change with regards to the elements that you see represented here in the model. So how it works is that you have elements here, building blocks, the green ones. And if all of those are in place, you get successful change. And that's what we're aiming for, right? What we felt in the case study before is that this didn't happen. There was a resistance to that change. And then I think for myself, okay, do I understand, or do I feel that all these elements or building blocks are actually in place? Is there a vision on where we're heading with this team? Is there a vision on the product that we deliver? And is there a vision on how to maybe even optimize or how to work together towards our vision? Then is there a consensus within the group of people? Is there a consensus with regards to, but we all agree as well that this should be the right direction and that we want to go there and move to that dot on the horizon? do we then have the skills available in order to actually execute on that vision that we stated with ourselves? If we have the skills, then do we also have the resources? So the resources, skills and resources. Skills is internally, do we have the competences? Do we have, like, as a team, as a group of people, do we have the skills in order to perform? Do we have the resources? Do we get the time? Do we get the systems? Do we have the system in place? Do we get the right support and guidance in order to execute on the vision again? Now, are there the right incentives? So do we, both incentives, intrinsic and extrinsic, so both in, do we get the right salary or like that sort of stuff, but also are success stories shared? Do we get motivated by maybe our manager, or if it's specific agile roles, the scrum master or the product owner, or each other preferably? So that's intrinsic motivation. So that's the incentives. And last but not least, is there an action plan on how to execute? Depending again on the framework you're using, but do we know, like, stepwise how to move forward? And maybe this sounds a little bit like common sense, but it can be very strong and impactful if something like that happens, to go into the meta, sit down and reflect on, okay, how about these elements in the Knoster model for successful change? The other way around as well. If you feel in the room, and that's what I felt with the previous case study, that there is some sort of like a frustration, or maybe even that there is confusion, so it can be multiple of the reactions that you see on the right-hand side. Hey, might it be there's a lack of vision, or that and a lack of resources? Well, in this case, this was really much the case. They had no clue even what Scrum was, nor Agile, nor where some of you mentioned that, what is actually the gap analysis of the pain points. So there was no vision at all. Neither was there resources. They were sitting there in a room for 2 hours with somebody talking, and they actually had a lot of things to do still on their own agenda, and then there was no resource of time for them. So that caused frustration. So this model can work two ways. Either you look at the certain set of behavior that you're recognizing, and then you say, hey, might it be that I'm missing this element? Or you double check, moving from the beginning, so starting with the vision, then go to check, that's clear. Consensus, check, we have that, that's clear. And go and move forward. So honestly, one of my favorites. So building it up, looking at which biases do we have cognitively. Oh, okay, then it makes sense people react in that way. Hey, now let's do a further deep dive and an analysis. Okay, maybe I can look at these elements and these building blocks to successful change, but also just putting this on the screen and telling the team, hey, if we want to move forward and we want to innovate, then there is this model and that states we have these building blocks. Where would you score yourself on a grading from 1 to 5 with regards to vision, with regards to consensus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very powerful and impactful as well. People tend to feel this and understand this. So if you want to find the model yourself, you can just Google this one, and all the information is on the YouTube, obviously, or on the Google, obviously. So this was for team resistance. Anything that we resistance here on the right, anything that we face with regards to behavior coming from teams, unproductive with what you're trying to achieve. But now, how about management? Can we use the same? Actually, oh yeah, I forgot to mention this, by the way. Although I love the model, this is something I kind of dislike here, because in my opinion, all of the above here on the right, so anxiety, sabotage, confusion, and the treadmill that you see here, are also behavior that is a sort of resistance. So with missing the incentives here and then stating it's resistance, I kind of disagree. I would say it should have demotivation right here. So if you lack the incentives, I would say it's showing in demotivation of your team. But that's my side note. This model, that's the funny thing, originates actually from like a study on change management on higher like C-level context. So it is to be, you can look at it, I want to say, as well for management level resistance. So if we take another case study, also one that's happened in my surrounding or my context the last 4 years, somewhere in the last 4 years. I want to try to challenge you to see if we read out the case study that's now more on management level, could you spot and link that to anything that you see here on the model, either a form of resistance that this manager shows or an element of the change model that's lacking. So try to think of it in that way, and you can answer again in chat. The situation is now as follows. Resistance on management level. You are working with an IT manager in a big corporate. He has hired you as an agile coach to assist in the implementation of SAFe in this sense. He has a clear view on the transformation roadmap. First, a SAFe is a framework for scaled agile, for those who don't recognize this, but so it's implementing agile at Scrum at large scale, scaled agile framework. First, he thinks that he can just have his own department, which is an IT manager's own department, as the first art on a value stream. And you, from your perspective, kind of disagree because you want to connect IT and business. So you think it's not the best idea to just take the original organization outline and structure and then plot that directly on the SAFe framework. So the first art on the value stream. So to simplify it, what's basically happening is somebody is asking you to go into a change transformation, but then thinks he should just keep the organization as is, and then things can change as well. And you disagree. You get into a little conflict here because somehow you cannot convince this person, and you can really feel that this person is really sticking to its own belief. And I get already some nice answers from people. Can you try to plot it on this one? If you plot it on the Knoster change model, then what do you recognize in this case study if you look at this model? Is there an element missing? Do you see not aligned to a vision? Lacking skills and vision. There could be an incentive for this person that is more on the personal rather than the team or the department. Yeah. Lacking consensus, great. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I see all these great answers popping up in the chat. So see that you're already trying to think following this structure. That's really nice. The funny thing is, what I just did is actually gave him this model. And first only the green element. So first only this line, the first line, I mentioned, hey, you say you want some sort of successful change. This is what we need in order to reach that. Hey, I agree was the response. And then plop, prompting everything below. If this is missing, this would happen. If that's missing, that would happen. And this had like facilitated the best conversation that could have happened. And as some of you mentioned as well, trying to understand, having a conversation, well, that's exactly what you can have while prompting this model. So at that point, we found out actually that there was the vision and the consensus on where should we go to and what should we strive for was something that was not aligned. And on top of that, there was something else also had to do a little bit with the ego of, hey, I have to let go of something that I set in place before. So it's and there you go back to the biases again. You see that there's a certain bias here. I already made this decision before, years ago. So I don't want to let that go, because maybe then it feels for me like I made an incorrect decision at that point in time. So that's the biases that came in, and then on top of that, this vision and consensus that was lacking. And what will you do next? Because that's this last question, what will you do next as an Agile coach? Well, it's quite easy from there if somebody like him agrees with you, hey, indeed, we had a conversation about this and I agree that on vision and consensus there's something missing. Then you can start to implement your own interventions or your workshops as an Agile coach, or doing some sort of like coaching interventions, as I said. So it's opening up the conversation, and that's where this one is very helpful in. So summing it up, there we have that again. It is all about what we see there with behavior of people. Now, what can we do? We kind of try to tune in with somebody. Think of, okay, which biases might be occurring here. Listen and ask questions to actually do that analysis. Then try to find out which type of resistance you are actually dealing with here. Maybe with the Knoster model, or I would say yes with the Knoster model. And seek for that missing element. So the building blocks, and then set an appropriate intervention. And this is actually a cycle that goes on and on and on, because at a later point in time, when the vision and the consensus are actually more aligned, then you might want to like work on either one of these on the lower levels as well. So it's also actually building your own coaching or consulting roadmap that you do. So this is some sort of like the steps I like to use, including biases, Knoster. And then as a last bit for this webinar today, once again, if we really would start working with this, we would really go into the details here or have a discussion on how to do that. But to really make it like a full story or the whole picture complete, we need to talk about one last thing. So we have a bias in the individual coming from a cognitive process. We have a complex model, a model for complex chains. And then last but not least, we have to deal with the organization, because teams work in an organizational context and management works in an organizational context. So resistance is dependent on what happens in that context. And what you see here on the slide is an article. It's called Jumping the Chasm. You can Google that if you are interested in reading the article, but what does it do? It states that any transformation that we would go in, any change that we want to see happening, goes through certain phases. And then we again talk about agile transformation right there. Just think of sequencing. We might want to first work with the teams. So with the first case study, see where the pain points are, and might one of the agile frameworks help us? And then work with the teams on that, which is the action you do as a coach. Then we might want to think about value and optimizing the value. So having teams collaborating to think of the bigger picture, phase 2. And that grows and grows as well. You do new interventions. Then you go to end-to-end teams. So can we think about how to deliver continuous value from A to Z and from end to end? And there you already might want to change the organizational structure again. Like you actually do that here and here as well a bit. And then last but not least, how do we really tilt the organization and really go into an organizational agile transformation, changing the organizational structures? And what this story tells is that this is difficult, especially the last bit. It's a gap. You have to jump it. Each new step is a small jump as well. You have a go agile decision going here as well. Go agile, go agile, go agile. Hey, and now we really have to tilt if we think about the whole organization going into a transformation. And this is a big jump to take, and you cannot take the jump in 2 turns. You really have to think like, okay, yeah, we did the pre-phases, we worked on the pre-phases, but we now want to maybe think about HR or our compliance structure or finance to also think via a different mindset or structure. And in all these phases, you as an agile coach can do different interventions and might prompt, there we have it again, might be prompt to different forms of resistance as well. So in each of these stages, you have to deal with a different, you can be dealing with a different type of resistance as an agile coach. So basically 3 things that we have in place here. 1, every individual has some sort of a set of biases that are totally natural. We like to have everything in place in order to facilitate a complex change. And we have to look at the context of the organization before we can make anything happen. And there's on each of these phases that you see here, which is more of a trend. This is something that we, from the consultancy path, have experienced. It goes from team to department to end-to-end teams. And then, last but not least, organizational structures which adapt to agility. You do team coaching, coaching on program level, coaching on the management teams and executives, and coaching on actually transforming organizational structures. Yeah, and the article is already, there's a nice article shared in the chat as well. Obviously, this is quite complex, combining the 3 things that we have been talking about. As mentioned in the start of this session, the only thing we can do here is like fly over it and prompt you a little bit to start thinking about the complexity actually of resistance. And luckily, that's what you said here as well. It's not one thing, but resistance can show on all different forms.